An author of a book, The Real Crash, America's Coming Bankruptcy. Nice to have you here.
Thanks for having me on.
And let's start off with your book about America's coming bankruptcy. Give me your overview of where you think the American economy is.
Well, first of all, it's my most recent book. The first book I wrote came out in February of 2007, and that was called Crash Proof: How to Profit from the Coming Economic Collapse. The reason this book is titled The Real Crash is because the economic collapse that I wrote about in my '07 book hasn't happened yet. In that book, I did write about the housing bubble and why I believed it was going to burst, or why I believed there was a bubble.
You were right on the leading edge of that.
And I wrote about the ensuing financial crisis that would result from the bursting of the housing bubble. And so I did forecast the Great Recession that began in 2007. But more important than that was what I believed would come next. And that hasn't happened yet. That's the real crash. Because what really was worrying me was I was afraid the government would respond to the financial crisis by doing more of the same policies that caused it, which is more deficit spending, more cheap money, more central banking and central planning. And as a result, I think the U.S. economy is now poised for a much bigger collapse. I think that what's coming is a sovereign debt crisis and a currency crisis that will make the financial crisis of '08, look like, the proverbial Sunday school picnic. I think that it's going to be much worse than what Europe has been going through.
And do you think that investors and Americans are prepared for that?
Well, not at all.
So how do you tell them that? How do you prepare people for that?
Well, in many cases, the tendency is to shoot the messenger. So a lot of people, don't want to hear it. But I think I've been able to get some credibility with a minority of the public. We have a lot of clients of my brokerage firm that are investing with me, and we're trying to help people at least protect their savings. I think the biggest threat is to the value of the dollar. And so a lot of Americans who depend on the dollar, depend on its value for their standard of living, people who are retired or people who have accumulated a lot of financial wealth, they need to take action quickly to divest themselves. So we recommend that clients own gold and silver. We help them invest abroad, including up here in Canada. We buy foreign stocks, foreign currencies. We look for ways to diversify globally to reduce the reliance on the U.S. dollar.
So you were at the leading edge of seeing what was happening in the real estate market and subprime. So, and now you're calling for this situation, the basic collapse of the currency and a meltdown in the economy. What do you see that maybe others don't see, or how do you read that?
I don't know. I haven't bought into all the Keynesian nonsense, so I think I think a little bit more clearly. It's not that I'm smarter than everybody else.
You're looking for different things.
Well, my judgment isn't so clouded by a lot of that dogma, and so I think my head's on straight, and I think I can think logically about things. I mean, if you go back to the housing bubble, and so many people just got caught up in the idea that housing prices always rose, that they never bothered to figure what might happen if they fell. But to me, it seemed obvious that housing prices would fall eventually. And since I understood that, then I can connect the dots to see what was going to happen. But if you were operating under the premise that real estate prices could never fall, if you drank so much of that Kool-Aid, then it didn't matter. How much data you got, you still couldn't figure out what was going to happen. And I think people still have this view of the U.S. as this, supremacy of our economy, of the almighty dollar. We're the biggest economy in the world, and they've lost track of why America was successful in the first place, and why America of today bears no resemblance to America of the past, and that right now we're just living literally on borrowed time. We're not producing. We have gigantic trade deficits. We have enormous liabilities, budget deficits, national debt. We're borrowing from every country in the world to live beyond our means, and we're now so addicted to debt that the highest interest rate we can afford is zero.
And today, President Obama being inaugurated, and we're dealing with another 4 years. Do you see any kind of easing of any of this in the next 4 years?
No, I think he might wish that he didn't win the re-election, because I think he's going to have a tough time. He thinks he's going to build this legacy, in his second term. This is when it's going to hit the fan. Also today, he was he appointed some new cabinet officers. He signed, one of them, we're getting a new Secretary of the Treasury. And as I'm watching him sign this paper, I'm thinking to myself, why do we even have a Secretary of the Treasury? We don't have a Treasury. There's no treasurer. We have debt. We need to have a Secretary of the Debt. And really the job of the Secretary of the Treasury is basically to convince the world to loan us money even though we're broke and even though we're threatening to default if we can't borrow more.
So what's the answer then? Increasing taxes? Is that part of the answer?
Well, that's not the right answer, but increasing taxes are better than increasing deficits. But the problem is the politicians don't want to tell the voters that they have to pay for government. I mean, they're willing to raise taxes on the 1%, but unfortunately, the rich are already overtaxed. They're bearing a disproportionately high burden of the tax, and raising taxes on the wealthy through increasing the marginal rate of income tax is probably going to backfire because the wealthy just won't work as hard. They won't produce as much. They won't pay as much taxes. They won't hire as many people. Many people might just retire. So if we're going to have more taxes, we need more taxes on the middle class. But the middle class is already struggling with this economy. So the real answer is not taxes, but cuts in government spending. And not just, trivial cuts around the edges. We need real deep cuts. We need to abolish entire agencies and departments. We need to cut, not reform entitlements. We actually need to cut them.
Yet governments keep growing, and they're going in the opposite direction.
They're growing, and we're already broke. And so we have to have bigger and bigger debts to finance them. But meanwhile, we can't finance them. The Federal Reserve is now monetizing the majority of the debt. Something like 90% of the new Treasury issuance is being taken up by the Fed. And the Fed can only do that as long as the world is willing to warehouse those dollars. And dollars, are piling up in sovereign wealth funds or in, reserves, dollar reserves in central banks all around the world. We're exporting our inflation to other countries instead of real stuff. And so we're exporting our problems. And it's a big burden on the global economy to have to shoulder, to have to subsidize the United States.
Okay, speaking of burdens, what happens in the event that interest rates rise?
Well, when interest rates rise, the party's over. And that's why the Fed won't raise them. Now, they're going to come up with every kind of excuse why they're not going to raise them, except the truth. The truth is that we can't handle it. The U.S. economy is so addicted, I said, to cheap money, that the highest rate we can afford is zero. Because if interest rates went up, all those big banks that we bailed out with a TARP, they would fail again. And the problem is, because we bailed them out, they got even bigger. And the federal government, the only reason the federal government can service the debt is because the rates are so low. If interest rates went up and America had to pay a legitimate rate of interest on the debt we've already accumulated, we couldn't even pay the interest on the debt, let alone retire any of the principal. So in order to keep the world from recognizing that solvency problem, the Fed keeps interest rates low, but the only way they can do that is to keep printing money, which eventually is going to crash the dollar.
Pretty much back right into a corner you can't get out of then.
Yeah, I mean, we are going to be stuck between a rock and a hard place. The Fed is going to have to choose between destroying the dollar and deflating the bubble. But politically, they will resist doing the right thing as long as possible. Because as long as there's a way out, they're not going to do the right thing. And so right now, because we can borrow money, because the world is willing to hold dollars, we can get away with these huge deficits. But at some point, a crisis is going to force us to reluctantly do what needs to be done. But because we waited so long to do it, the problem is that much bigger.
And is it that much bigger as well because we look what's happening in Europe and the Eurozone crisis, and are the two then converging?
Well, the Eurozone crisis, ironically, was the best thing we had going for us. Because people thought that Europe was in worse shape than America, which was wrong. But people were buying treasuries to get out of Eurozone debt, even though we owe more money. I mean, if we were part of the Eurozone, right, the world would be worried about us. We would be one of the pigs. We might even be the biggest pig. But the fact is we're printing the reserve currency, and so nobody is worried about America defaulting because they know that we can print. But that is the problem. And pretty soon the world is not going to be worried about default, but worry about printing. Because really, it's a distinction without a difference. Not getting paid back and being paid back in worthless money is the same thing. And ultimately, that's what's going to happen if we keep printing. The money's not going to have any value.
So for investors then, if they see what's going on here and they believe what you're saying and they see the implications of that, what do they do next? What are they supposed to do with their money now to remain in a pretty good place and to find opportunities?
Get it out of the dollar if it's in the U.S. dollar. But I think you have to look at some of the emerging economies, look at Southeast Asia, look at countries that are doing it right, or at least making fewer mistakes. And so you want to have countries that don't have a big entitlement class mentality where people aren't voting for something from government. You want people that save money, don't spend money. Governments that have budgets that are in balance, where the government is a smaller part of the GNP, where you have trade surpluses, current account surpluses, and invest in that part of the world. Invest where there's going to be real economic growth. The people who are saving today, they're going to have a bright tomorrow. In America, we sacrifice our future to indulge the here and now. But we are setting ourselves up for a huge fall. And the political ramifications are very ominous for the United States, because the impetus in Washington is to continue to do the wrong thing and continue to blame capitalism for failures of socialism. And every time government interferes in the economy and it creates a problem, they always blame it on capitalism, even though capitalism would have prevented the problem. And so every time there's a crisis, we get more government. Well, we're staring at the biggest crisis yet. And it is a very frightening proposition about how much government we theoretically could end up with in America, which will be very destructive.
So some people are seeing this and then they're putting their money into gold because it's a safe bet. And in fact, you were the one who saw gold going to 5,000. Do you still see that?
Yeah, well, I've been saying that since it was under 300.
So you still believe that?
Yeah, and it might actually go a lot higher than that. Because we're still, pursuing these inflationary policies, and eventually, who knows? I mean, there might not be a number large enough to describe what the price is going to be, at least in terms of U.S. dollars. It might not go that high. It won't in Canadian dollars or some other currency.
Canadian dollars? They're good as American dollars right now, or they're at par anyway. So, in what time frame are you talking about? Do you see 5,000 or do you see 3,000 even?
I don't know. It should, as far as I'm concerned, it should probably already be at 2,500 or 3,000, maybe higher. Not only based on how much inflation has already been created, but based on how much inflation is going to be created. The gold market should be looking forward and recognizing this. I mean, they are going to be printing so much money, not just in America, but all around the world. And, it's easy to print money. It's not that easy to mine gold. I mean, first of all, you got to find it. And the cost of mining has gone up dramatically.
Well, and some of the jurisdictions aren't very stable either.
No. I mean, a lot of the areas where gold is are very unstable. I mean, look at South Africa, which used to be the world's largest gold producer. Look at political reasons. Now China is the biggest gold producer. But how much of that gold is ever going to make it out of China? None of it. China doesn't even export. They import gold.
Well,
even though they're the world's biggest producer.
I want to ask you a little bit about China because, a year or so ago, there was some concern about some of the numbers coming out of China. Were they real? What's really happening? Growth has slowed a bit. Is there a flag for you about it when you look at China? What's going on there?
I don't look at government numbers. I think governments lie. I mean, pretty much all around. But I mean, what doesn't lie are the facts. And I can go into stores and I can look at all this merchandise that was made in China. So there's real economic activity going on there. Just go to China. Just look around. You can see what's happening in the country. And if you've been there, in the past, you can see the changes. You can see cities coming up. You see how the people dress. You look at the restaurants. You can see the vibe in the cities. So there's real economic growth. Living standards are rising in China. Whereas in America, they talk about all of our economic growth and all of our productivity. Meanwhile, our trade deficit gets bigger and bigger and bigger. We keep going deeper into debt. How can we be productive if we're getting poor? At least China is getting richer. Look at the net foreign exchange reserves. The Chinese have over $3 trillion. They earned all those reserves. Their economy was productive enough that they produced those surpluses. America's economy is a basket case. We're hemorrhaging red ink. So I don't care what the government says. Just look at reality. Look at the output of the countries. Which country is operating in the black and which country is operating in the red?
Do you think, Peter, that perception is starting to change, that because of people like you and opinions like yours, that people are starting to take a different look at the U.S. economy, the U.S. administration, and asking some questions?
Some people are. I mean, certainly in the minority. I think the majority of the investors, or certainly the institutional class of investors, people that are paid a lot of money to manage other people's money, are still clueless. I think the same people who were buying all the dot-com stocks at the peak, the same people who were buying mortgages and houses at the peak, they're the same people that are calling the shots now, investing the big money, and they still don't understand what's going on. They still look at maybe the financial crisis of '08 as some random 100-year flood that nobody could have predicted, and they still don't understand what caused it and why this next crisis is going to be bigger. In fact, they just released the Fed minutes from 2007. And none of these guys saw this crisis coming, even though the recession had already started, even though the housing bubble had already burst. And these are the same guys that are in power today. And these are the same guys that are telling us that we don't have to worry about anything.
So what's the top thing you're telling investors for 2013?
Well, just it's not as rosy as the mainstream spin. The economy is not recovering. We're sicker than ever. We just don't know it yet. There's a lot of talk about Lance Armstrong, right? Because we got the Lance Armstrong economy. I don't know why we are so critical of Lance Armstrong. We ought to just erect a monument to him. We ought to maybe put his image on our money, because our whole economy is based on artificial stimulus. And it's all about Lance Armstrong.
Peter, thank you very much. Really interesting conversation.
Thanks for having me on.